You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I got a question from a viewer that I think is good enough that I wanted to make an entire episode of The Legal Breakdown about this. So we are right now awaiting any movement in terms of what Jack Smith is going to do regarding Donald Trump's ongoing prosecutions in D.C. and Florida. And so we're waiting to see if Jack Smith is going to dismiss them or if he's going to allow Trump's DOJ to corruptly dismiss them, and that would give us the opportunity to resurrect these cases, possibly at a future date. Now, what happens in the event that Donald Trump's DOJ, once they get hold of all of the documents and the evidence and the testimony, if they decide to just destroy it all, thereby precluding a future DOJ from bringing this case forward with all of the documents and testimony and evidence that they've gathered thus far?
Very, very difficult to do. And here's why, Brian. The evidence that has been generated during Jack Smith's investigation of Donald Trump's democracy-busting crimes on and around January 6th is spread across multiple agencies of government of necessity. So, for example, the FBI conducted countless interviews during the course of the investigation. Here's how it works. Before I, as a federal prosecutor, will put a witness before the grand jury, the first thing that we do is we interview them. Either the FBI interviews them or the FBI and the federal prosecutor together interviews them. And the FBI generates a document called an FBI 302. That is the form they use to document everything that was said during that witness interview. That is retained at the FBI. It's retained in databases. It's retained in hard copy. Similarly, when somebody then goes into the grand jury, and what we know, Brian, is countless Republican witnesses. I have maintained all along that if we could get the case to trial in D.C., Donald Trump would be convicted by a chorus made up almost exclusively of Republican witnesses. When they go into the grand jury, there is a grand jury record. There is an audio tape, or I assume we don't use audio tapes anymore. But actually, when I retired from the Department of Justice in 2018, the grand jury reporters were still using audio tapes, not digital. Those are retained by grand jury reporters. They're retained by agencies within the Department of Justice. There are hard copies of it made. And much of it, Brian, has made its way into the court files, right? Everything that Jack Smith attached to the pleadings that he filed in federal court in Washington, D.C., those records are maintained there. So Donald Trump would have to engage in this sort of sweeping effort across multiple agencies of government to try to purge the federal government of all of the evidence that has been collected up by Jack Smith, by the FBI. I think Donald Trump could try. Of course, if he did, it may very well constitute the impeachable offense of obstructing justice. Who's going to impeach Donald Trump in a second Trump term, particularly if the House of Representatives remains in the control of the Republicans, because that's where an impeachment starts, in the House. I think he can try his nefarious best. I think it would be all but impossible to purge, to destroy permanently all of the evidence that Jack Smith has accumulated during the investigation of Trump's crimes.
The flip side of that, Glenn, is let's say, for example, that Jack Smith wants to get the entire case, everything, all of the evidence, all of the testimony, all of the witness testimony into the public record now. The problem with that, then, I would assume, is that he would basically give his case away, and that would be the case that the DOJ would hope to wage against him in the event that he does go to trial in the future. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if Jack Smith wants to get all of this information into the public sphere now, he would do that at the risk of basically showing his cards. And that's the whole point of this, is that you don't want to show your cards in hopes that some future prosecution might have some legs.
You're exactly right. Federal prosecutors usually play their cards very close to the vest. They don't want to disclose anything they're not required by law to disclose in discovery, for example. They don't want to disclose it before trial time. The reality here is there may never be a trial time in this case. Right. So I strongly suspect Jack Smith is preparing a special counsel report, as almost all special counsel do. And he's going to end up disclosing lots and lots of evidence and information that, if he had the hope of going to trial, he would not be interested in disclosing at this point, because it would be premature to disclose it if a trial were a reality. I feel like the hopes of a trial against Donald Trump grew very, very dim when the American people decided to elect him again as president. It's not impossible that he could still be tried after he completes either this 4-year term or maybe doesn't complete this 4-year term, in the event he negotiates some kind of a quid pro quo from his vice president, J.D. Vance, that, I, Donald Trump, will resign. You pardon me, and then I slouch off to Mar-a-Lago. And if he is pardoned, of course, there would be no federal prosecution if the courts deemed that the pardon was not corrupt, that it was a lawful exercise of presidential power. So I see the pathway to a trial of Donald Trump to be so narrow that I'm not sure anybody will be able to successfully squeeze through it, which militates in favor of Jack Smith putting all of the evidence in the public record, documented for history and posterity. And who knows, maybe someday it will produce a prosecution in the future, but at least let's get it out there so the American people know what we're contending with.
Well, just on the issue of a pardon, which you had brought up a few moments ago, didn't the Supreme Court already come out and say that any pardon, that a president decides to give can't even be challenged? So if Donald Trump did decide to give himself a pardon for all of this stuff, based on this new Supreme Court precedent, hasn't the Supreme Court already said that it's permissible?
The Supreme Court has said that. It seems to have put a criminal pardon above the law and beyond the reach of prosecutors. When I say a criminal pardon, a president could commit a crime and then could use a pardon to buy the silence of the witnesses against him, witnesses who could incriminate him. And it seems the Supreme Court has said, that's all good. The president gets wide berth, and if you're president, you get to do it. We are back in the early 70s when Richard Nixon said, if a president does it, it's not illegal. Unfortunately, all these decades later, the Supreme Court seems to have put its stamp of approval on that rampant illegality by a criminal president. But here's the thing. You never know unless you test a criminal pardon in court. It may be that a future Supreme Court, if it is composed of different justices who actually show allegiance to the rule of law and the Constitution, are presented with the issue of whether a criminally delivered pardon by a president should fall under the presidential immunity ruling. Maybe they will rule differently. Here's the other thing. A criminally delivered pardon may be immune from prosecution. However, it could arguably serve as the basis of an impeachment if you had a House of Representatives that cared about the rule of law and the Constitution. So I'm with you. It seems like the Supreme Court has basically given Donald Trump and any president carte blanche to commit whatever crime he can conjure up using a pardon as part of that crime. But you know what? You're never going to make the shot you don't take. So maybe someday in the future, this issue of criminal presidential pardons will be revisited.
Okay, well, we will stay on top of this if we have any updates in this area, as well as some answer with regard to what Jack Smith is going to do with the D.C. prosecution and the Florida prosecution, if he's going to dismiss them or try and allow them to just remain on the docket there and allow the Trump DOJ to corruptly dismiss it in hopes that one day in the future it'll be resurrected. But a lot to come on this whole area of study here. For those who are watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen, and that is the best way to support our work and stay with us in this fight, because the next 4 years are going to have a lot of it. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.